Stay down!
Look at him! Pathetic!
Stop it! Please stop!
Dust swirled across the scorched asphalt as 20 custom Harley-Davidsons roared to a violent halt, their riders proudly sporting the notorious Death's Head patch of the Hells Angels. Inside the lonely highway diner sat a frail, crippled veteran, sipping black coffee, completely unaware that his quiet morning was about to mutate into a brutal nightmare. Bikers thought he was just an easy target, a broken old man they could humiliate for a cheap laugh. They pushed him. They shattered his crutches. They laughed in his face. What those arrogant outlaws failed to realize was that this disabled soldier had family. 20 minutes later, 3 unmarked black SUVs tore into that very same parking lot, unleashing a hyper-violent fury the bikers would never forget. 74-year-old Richard Caldwell liked the silence of the desert. Every Tuesday morning, precisely at 6:30, Richard parked his battered Ford F-150 outside the Rusty Skillet, a sun-bleached diner sitting on the lonely stretch of Route 66 just outside Barstow, California. Richard was a creature of absolute habit. He walked with a heavy, pronounced limp, relying on a custom steel forearm crutch to support the weight his left side could no longer carry. His left leg, from the knee down, had been left in the muddy jungles of the Ashau Valley during the Vietnam War in 1969. He pushed through the glass door, the familiar bell ringing above his head. The diner smelled of stale coffee, frying bacon, and floor wax. Richard navigated his way to his usual spot, a large red vinyl corner booth that offered a clear view of the highway and the sprawling Mojave Desert beyond. He carefully rested his crutch against the wall, slid into the booth, and placed his faded olive-drab ball cap on the table. The hat bore the embroidered ribbons of the Silver Star and the Purple Heart. "Morning, Richard," Clara said, walking over with a steaming glass carafe. Clara was a waitress in her late 50s, wearing a pink uniform that had seen better decades. She poured his coffee black, exactly how he liked it. "Morning, Clara," Richard replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Looks like it's going to be a hot one today." "Thermometer is already pushing 80, and the sun barely crested," Clara sighed, wiping down the edge of his table. "You want the usual? 2 eggs over easy, burnt toast, and a side of Lynx?" "You know me too well," Richard smiled. For the next hour, the diner was a sanctuary of peace. A few local truckers filtered in and out, the low hum of their conversations blending with the soft twang of country music playing from the jukebox. Richard ate his breakfast slowly, reading a paperback thriller, enjoying the simple privilege of a quiet retirement. He had paid dearly for his peace, leaving a piece of himself in a foreign land and spending decades battling the ghosts that followed him home. Then, the silence broke. It started as a low, distant thunder rolling across the flat desert plains. The vibrations rattled the coffee cups on the saucers. Richard looked up from his book, his eyes narrowing toward the highway. The thunder grew exponentially louder, transforming into an earth-shaking guttural roar of straight pipe exhausts. Clara stopped wiping down the counter, a look of distinct unease washing over her face. Through the large front windows, a mechanical cavalry materialized from the heat haze. 20 heavy motorcycles pulled into the Rusty Skillet's parking lot, their tires kicking up massive clouds of blinding dust. They parked diagonally, deliberately taking up multiple spaces and entirely blocking the exit lanes. The riders killed their engines almost simultaneously, but the aggressive aura lingered in the air. They dismounted, a sea of black leather, denim, and heavy boots. On their backs, the iconic and heavily feared top and bottom rockers wrapped around the winged Death's Head logo. They were the Hells Angels, specifically members of a notorious Southern California chapter known for running narcotics and enforcing their territory with ruthless violence. Leading the pack was a monstrous man known on the streets as Deacon. He stood 6'4", weighing close to 300 pounds, with a thick, unkempt beard and a swastika tattooed directly over his right eyebrow. Beside him walked his sergeant-at-arms, a wiry, meth-scarred enforcer named Roach, whose eyes darted around with manic, unpredictable energy. The bell above the door chimed frantically as the gang poured inside. Instantly, the atmosphere in the Rusty Skillet mutated from welcoming to terrifying. The bikers were loud, obnoxious, and commanded the space with a predator's entitlement. They kicked chairs out of their way, shouted obscenities, and slammed their heavy fists on the counters. The few civilian patrons in the diner immediately lowered their heads, suddenly fascinated by their half-eaten plates of food. Fear was a currency the Hells Angels traded in daily, and they were actively cashing out. Richard watched them with calm, calculating eyes. His military training, ingrained decades ago, instinctively kicked in. He noted their numbers, 19 men. He noted their weapons. Several carried heavy hunting knives openly on their belts, and the heavy bulges under Deacon's and Roach's leather cuts practically screamed concealed firearms. Clara stood frozen behind the cash register, her hands trembling. "Hey, sweetheart!" Deacon bellowed, his voice echoing off the cheap tin ceiling. "We need 4 tables pushed together. Now! And bring every drop of coffee you got in this dump." Clara nodded frantically, rushing to comply, but the bikers weren't interested in waiting. They began shoving tables around themselves, the metal legs shrieking against the linoleum floor. Roach, the wiry enforcer, scanned the room. His manic eyes locked onto the large corner booth by the window, the best seat in the house. The seat currently occupied by a solitary, gray-haired man reading a paperback. Roach smirked, nudging Deacon and pointing a dirty finger toward Richard. Deacon grinned, revealing a row of rotting, gold-capped teeth. The pack of wolves had found their prey. Roach detached himself from the main group, his heavy engineer boots thudding ominously against the floor. He swaggered over to Richard's booth, followed closely by 3 other patched members. The rest of the gang watched, chuckling, anticipating the cruel entertainment that was about to unfold. Richard didn't look up from his book. He calmly turned a page, though his heart rate steadily began to climb. Roach stopped right at the edge of the table, crossing his arms. He smelled overwhelmingly of stale beer, body odor, and exhaust fumes. "Hey, Grandpa," Roach sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're in our booth." Richard slowly closed his book, marking the page with a napkin. He looked up, his expression entirely neutral. "There are plenty of empty tables in the back, son. I'm currently eating here." The use of the word son caused Roach's jaw to clench. The 3 bikers behind him laughed maliciously. "I don't think you heard me, old man," Roach said, leaning forward and planting his filthy hands on Richard's clean table. "This is a Hells Angels chapter run. When we walk into a room, we take the best seats. You're sitting in the best seat. So, you're going to pack up your little book, and you're going to hobble out of here before I use your skull to paint that window." A heavy silence fell over the diner. The country music on the jukebox had stopped, leaving only the agonizing hum of the refrigerator compressor. A trucker, 2 booths down, half stood, intending to intervene. "Sit back down, fat boy," one of the bikers barked, pulling a heavy brass knuckle duster from his pocket. The trucker immediately sank back into his seat, terrified. Richard didn't flinch. He reached out, slowly picked up his coffee cup, and took a deliberate sip. He set it down. "I fought for the right to sit in peace in my own country," Richard said, his voice steady. "I'm not moving for a bunch of grown men playing dress-up." Roach's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. He noticed the olive drab hat resting on the table. He snatched it up, his dirty fingers smudging the embroidered silver star. "Hey!" Richard barked, his voice suddenly sharp. "Put the hat down." "What's this?" Roach mocked, dangling the hat by the brim. "Vietnam? Oh, wow. We got a real hero here, boys. A hero from a war we lost. You fought for nothing, old man. You're a loser, just like every other sucker who went to that jungle." Deacon walked over, his massive frame casting a dark shadow over the booth. "What's the problem here, Roach? Grandpa having trouble hearing?" "He says he ain't moving, boss," Roach laughed. "Says he's a war hero." Deacon looked at Richard, his eyes devoid of any human empathy. "I hate veterans. Always whining about respect. You want respect?" Deacon suddenly lashed out, violently sweeping his massive arm across the table. Richard's plate of eggs, his toast, and his heavy ceramic coffee mug went flying, shattering against the adjacent wall. Hot black coffee splashed directly onto Richard's chest and lap. Clara screamed from behind the counter. "Stop it! Leave him alone! I'm calling the police!" Call the cops, bitch, and we'll burn this diner to the ground with you in it, Deacon roared back. Richard gritted his teeth against the searing heat of the coffee soaking through his jeans. He reached into his jacket pocket. The bikers tensed, hands dropping to their waistbands, expecting a weapon. Instead, Richard pulled out a small, rugged flip phone. He didn't dial. He simply pressed his thumb hard against the single red speed dial button on the side. He held the phone in his palm, leaving the line open. "Calling for help, Grandpa?" Roach laughed, snatching the phone from Richard's hand. Roach looked at the screen. It just said, "Connected." Roach sneered and threw the phone onto the floor, crushing it under the heel of his heavy boot. The plastic shattered, but the green call light remained faintly illuminated in the debris. "You're out of time, old man," Roach hissed. He reached into the booth, grabbed Richard by the collar of his jacket, and violently yanked him out. Because of his amputated leg and lack of leverage, Richard came tumbling out of the booth, hitting the hard linoleum floor with a sickening thud. His steel crutch clattered away, sliding out of reach. Richard gasped for air. The wind knocked out of him. The diner erupted in cruel laughter. 19 Hells Angels stood around the fallen veteran, mocking his inability to stand up. "Look at the war hero now," Roach spat. He walked over and kicked Richard's steel crutch across the room. "Crawl out of here, loser. Crawl out the front door and maybe we won't stomp you to death." Richard lay on the floor, his face bruised from the fall, his prosthetic leg twisted awkwardly beneath him. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He just glared up at Deacon and Roach with a look of pure, unadulterated defiance. "You boys made a mistake today," Richard whispered, spitting a drop of blood onto the floor. Deacon chuckled, kneeling down to look Richard in the eye. "The only mistake here is you thinking anyone in this world gives a damn about you. Nobody is coming to save you." But Deacon was wrong. Across the shattered pieces of the flip phone, the open microphone had transmitted every single word, every shattered plate, and every agonizing thud directly to the receiving end. 15 miles away, deep within a highly restricted, heavily fenced expanse of the Mojave Desert, stood a classified tactical training facility. The sun beat down mercilessly on a complex of cinder-block shoot-houses and firing ranges. Inside a sterile, air-conditioned briefing room, 5 men sat around a steel table, reviewing satellite telemetry on digital tablets. These were not ordinary men. They were operators from the United States Navy's SEAL Team 3. At the head of the table sat Commander James Caldwell. He was 38 years old, built like a brick wall, with piercing blue eyes and a jawline cut from granite. James had spent his entire adult life conducting high-risk raids in the most dangerous, unforgiving corners of the globe. He was ruthless in combat, flawlessly tactical, and fiercely protective of his men. And Richard Caldwell was his father. On the table in front of James, his encrypted tactical smartphone sat on speaker. 2 minutes ago, the phone had silently auto-answered an incoming emergency override call from his father's custom phone. James had held up a hand, silencing his team. For 2 agonizing minutes, the deadliest men on the planet had sat in dead silence, listening to the audio feed. They heard the clinking of coffee cups. They heard the taunting voice of Roach. They heard the insult to the Vietnam veterans. They heard the sound of shattering ceramics. When they heard the unmistakable heavy thud of Richard Caldwell hitting the floor, followed by the cruel, roaring laughter of the bikers, the temperature in the briefing room seemed to drop 20 degrees. James didn't yell. He didn't display a single ounce of panic. Instead, his eyes went cold, shifting into a hyper-focused, lethal state that his men knew all too well. It was the look he had right before kicking down a door in Fallujah. James stood up. He picked up his phone, looking at his second-in-command, Chief Petty Officer Thomas Hayes. "Wait. No. Thomas Miller." "Chief Miller," James said, his voice eerily calm, smooth as glass. "Grab the tactical vests, load the non-lethals, but keep the live rounds holstered. We have a domestic priority." Miller, a heavily tattooed operator with a thick beard, didn't ask questions. He took one look at his commander's face and moved toward the armory locker. "Where are we going, boss?" "The rusty skillet on Route 66, James replied, grabbing a heavy Kevlar vest and strapping it over his desert digital camouflage uniform. Some local bikers decided to use my father for floor mat practice. The three other SEALs in the room, Petty Officer First Class Carter, Lieutenant Brooks, and Senior Chief Jackson, stood up simultaneously. Their chairs scraped against the floor in unison. Without a single word of hesitation, they moved with terrifying, synchronized speed. Within 90 seconds, all 5 men were fully kitted in tactical gear, armed with customized Sig Sauer P-226 sidearms, collapsible batons, and flex cuffs. They burst out of the briefing room and sprinted toward the motor pool. They bypassed the standard military transports and piled into 3 unmarked, armored, jet-black Chevrolet Suburbans. The engines roared to life, a deep, aggressive, supercharged hum that promised violence. James took the wheel of the lead vehicle. He slammed the gear shift into drive, burying the accelerator into the floorboards. The 3 heavy SUVs blew through the security gates of the facility, tires screaming against the asphalt as they hit the main desert highway. ETA is exactly 12 minutes at this speed, Chief Miller said from the passenger seat, calculating the distance on his GPS monitor. Make it 10, James replied, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He pushed the speedometer past 100 miles per hour. The desert landscape blurred outside the windows. The countdown had begun. Back at the Rusty Skillet, the Hells Angels were celebrating their perceived victory. Deacon had ordered Clara to lock the front doors and flip the sign to closed. He wanted the diner as his own private clubhouse for the morning. Richard was still on the floor. Every time he tried to push himself up using the edge of the booth, one of the bikers would casually kick his arm out from under him, sending him crashing back down. Roach was sitting in Richard's booth, wearing Richard's Silver Star hat backward, eating pancakes that Toby the cook had hastily prepared under threat of violence.
You know, old man,
Deacon said, standing over Richard and lighting a thick cigar. He blew the harsh smoke directly into Richard's face. I think we might keep you around. You're good entertainment. Maybe we'll tie you to the back of my Harley and see how fast you can hop on that one good leg. The gang erupted into applause and howling laughter. Clara wept silently behind the counter, too terrified to reach for the landline. The trucker, Bob, kept his head down, ashamed of his own cowardice, but knowing he was completely outmatched by the 19 armed thugs. Richard rested his head against the cold linoleum. His ribs throbbed from the fall, and his prosthetic leg was completely jammed. But as he looked out the large glass window toward the highway, he didn't feel fear. Far in the distance, cutting through the heavy heat waves rising off the black asphalt, Richard saw them. 3 black dots, moving at impossible speeds, growing rapidly larger. They weren't braking. They were driving in a tight, offensive convoy formation. Richard let out a slow, painful breath. A small, bloody smile crept across his bruised face. "What are you smiling at, you crippled piece of trash?" Roach snapped, noticing Richard's expression. Roach stood up, pulling a heavy steel wrench from his back pocket, intent on wiping the smile off the veteran's face permanently. "I'm smiling," Richard rasped, looking Roach dead in the eye. "Because my boy is here." Roach frowned in confusion. He turned to look out the window. The roar of the Suburban's massive engines suddenly eclipsed the sound of the jukebox. Before the Hells Angels could even process what they were looking at, the 3 armored vehicles swerved violently off the highway. They didn't park politely. They hit the parking lot at 60 miles per hour. The lead Suburban smashed directly into the line of parked Harley-Davidsons, crushing 6 expensive, custom-built motorcycles into twisted heaps of scrap metal like a bowling ball hitting pins. The screech of tearing metal and shattering fiberglass was deafening. The other 2 SUVs skidded into blocking positions, perfectly sealing off the perimeter. Inside the diner, the Hells Angels froze, their cigars dropping from their mouths, their laughter dying instantly in their throats. The doors of the black SUVs swung open, and the true predators stepped out. Glass shattered violently as the heavy wooden door of the Rusty Skillet was kicked open with enough kinetic force to rip the upper brass hinge entirely out of the splintering doorframe. The sudden, explosive entry sent a shockwave through the stifling air of the diner. 19 hardened, heavily tattooed criminals. Men who had spent their entire lives intimidating others through brute force and numbers, flinched in simultaneous, involuntary terror. Through the dust and swirling desert wind stepped Commander James Caldwell, He was flanked instantly by Chief Miller to his right and Lieutenant Brooks to his left, with Carter and Jackson aggressively securing the exterior perimeter to ensure absolutely no one escaped. The three operators who entered the diner moved with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity. They did not shout. They did not posture. They did not wave their weapons wildly in the air like the street thugs they were facing. Their Sig Sauer sidearms remained holstered. Instead, their hands rested loosely on the grips of their heavy, collapsible steel batons. The silence radiating from the SEALs was far more intimidating than any war cry. James's ice-blue eyes scanned the room in a fraction of a second, processing the tactical environment with machine-like efficiency. He bypassed the screaming waitress, the cowering trucker, and the stunned bikers. His gaze locked instantly onto the corner booth. He saw the shattered ceramic mug. He saw the puddle of dark, spilled coffee. And then he saw his father, 74-year-old Richard Caldwell, lying on the cheap linoleum floor, bruised, soaked, and missing his prosthetic support. A dangerous, suffocating tension sucked the oxygen out of the room. James's jaw tightened. Deacon, shaking off his initial shock, puffed out his chest. He was a giant of a man, accustomed to his size, granting him absolute authority. He dropped his cigar, crushing it beneath his heavy boot, and took a belligerent step toward the men in tactical gear. "Do you have any idea what you just did outside, you military wannabe freaks?" Deacon roared, his face turning a deep, mottled red. "You just crushed $100,000 worth of custom iron? I don't care who the hell you think you are. Nobody disrespects the Hells Angels. We are going to peel your skin off and—" Deacon never finished his sentence. James did not wait for the threat to materialize. He closed the 8-foot gap between them with explosive, blinding speed. Before Deacon's sluggish, alcohol-soaked brain could even register the movement, James drove the heel of his tactical boot directly into the biker boss's right kneecap. The horrific, audible crack of the joint snapping backward echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Deacon's eyes bugged out of his skull as his leg gave way. As the massive biker pitched forward, howling in sudden, blinding agony, James pivoted on his left foot, using Deacon's downward momentum against him. James delivered a devastating, precise horizontal elbow strike straight into Deacon's jaw. The impact shattered the biker's gold-capped teeth and instantly short-circuited his consciousness. All 300 pounds of the Hells Angels leader hit the floor like a sack of wet cement, completely neutralized in less than 2 seconds. Pandemonium erupted. The illusion of the gang's invincibility shattered instantly. "Kill them!" Roach screamed, his voice cracking with panic. He dropped his plate of pancakes and reached for the heavy, serrated hunting knife strapped to his hip. The remaining 17 bikers surged forward, a tidal wave of leather, fists, and improvised weapons, driven by the desperation of cornered animals. They expected a chaotic bar brawl. What they encountered was a surgical, hyper-violent dismantling. Chief Miller intercepted 3 bikers rushing the left flank. A heavy-set man with a chain wrapped around his knuckles threw a wild, looping haymaker aimed at Miller's head. Miller simply stepped inside the arc of the punch, trapped the biker's extended arm, and executed a flawless Krav Maga wrist lock. With a sharp, agonizing twist, the biker's elbow dislocated with a sickening pop. Miller didn't even pause to watch him fall. He immediately drove the reinforced bottom of his baton into the solar plexus of the second attacker, collapsing the man's lungs and dropping him to his knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. On the right side of the diner, Lieutenant Brooks was a blur of calculated devastation. 2 bikers tried to tackle him simultaneously. Brooks sidestepped, grabbed the closest attacker by the thick collar of his leather cut, and used the man's own momentum to launch him headfirst into the heavy steel frame of the jukebox. The glass shattered, cutting off the low hum of the machine, and the biker crumpled into an unconscious heap. Brooks seamlessly transitioned his grip, deploying his baton with a sharp clack, and struck the remaining attacker across the collarbone, fracturing it instantly. Outside, the sound of breaking glass and heavy thuds indicated that Carter and Jackson were enthusiastically handling the bikers, who had foolishly tried to sneak out the back emergency exit. Inside the Rusty Skillet, the fight was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. The Hells Angels relied on intimidation, alcohol-fueled rage, and swarm tactics. But against Tier 1 operators, men who trained 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, in hand-to-hand combat, room clearing, and threat neutralization, the bikers were moving in slow motion. Roach, hyperventilating and realizing the catastrophic mistake they had made, backed away from the carnage. His eyes darted toward the front door, looking for an escape. He was still wearing Richard's Silver Star hat backward on his head. James stepped over a groaning, bleeding biker and locked eyes with Roach. "You!" James said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly register. Roach panicked. He pulled the hunting knife free from its leather sheath, holding the 7-inch blade out in front of him with a trembling hand. "Stay back. I'll gut you. I swear to God, I'll gut you." James didn't slow his advance. He walked toward Roach with the calm, inevitable presence of a grim reaper. Roach lunged, thrusting the knife forward in a desperate, amateurish arc aimed at James's torso. James sidestepped the blade by mere inches. His left hand shot out like a striking viper, clamping down on Roach's wrist with the crushing force of a steel vise. James twisted the wrist outward, forcing Roach to drop the knife, which clattered uselessly onto the linoleum. With his right hand, James grabbed Roach by the throat, lifting the wiry enforcer entirely off the ground. Roach's legs kicked wildly in the air, his hands desperately clawing at James's thick, armored forearm. His face turned a deep, bruised purple as his airway was completely crushed off. James leaned in, his face inches from the terrified biker's bulging eyes. "You think you're tough because you can push an old man out of a booth? You think a leather vest makes you a warrior?" James whispered, the absolute venom in his voice, causing Clara, the waitress, to shiver. With his free hand, James reached up and carefully plucked his father's olive-drab hat off Roach's head. He then slammed Roach backward against the heavy wooden counter. The impact rattled the coffee pots. James released his grip just enough to let the biker take one ragged, desperate gasp of air before driving his knee upward, connecting squarely with Roach's ribs. 3 ribs snapped. Roach collapsed to the floor, curling into a pathetic, whimpering ball, coughing up blood and regret. The entire physical confrontation had lasted exactly 42 seconds. The diner, previously echoing with the arrogant laughter of 19 outlaws, was now filled with the agonizing groans of severely injured men. Not a single SEAL was breathing heavily. Not a single operator had a scratch on them. They stood amidst the carnage of broken tables, shattered glass, and groaning bodies, entirely unfazed by the violence they had just unleashed. "Miller, zip-tie this trash," James commanded, his voice returning to its normal, authoritative calm. "Brooks, check the perimeter. Make sure Jackson and Carter secured the stragglers out back." "Copy that, boss," Miller said, pulling a thick bundle of heavy-duty plastic flex cuffs from his tactical vest. He began rolling the groaning bikers onto their stomachs, brutally ratcheting their hands behind their backs. James ignored the whimpering men on the floor. He walked over to the corner booth and knelt down beside his father. The cold, lethal fury that had consumed his eyes moments ago melted away, replaced by deep, genuine concern. "Dad, are you okay?" James asked softly, reaching out to gently inspect the bruise forming on Richard's cheekbone. Richard looked up at his son, his chest heaving slightly. He glanced around the diner, taking in the absolute destruction of the men who had tormented him just minutes prior. A slow, proud smile broke through his pained expression. "I told them," Richard rasped, wiping a drop of blood from his chin. "I told them they made a mistake." James smiled back, a rare, genuine expression. "You always were good at calling it, old man." James hooked his massive arms under his father's shoulders and gently lifted him off the cold floor, supporting Richard's weight effortlessly. He guided his father back into the red vinyl booth. James then walked over to where Roach had kicked the custom steel forearm crutch. He retrieved it, wiped it clean with a napkin, and handed it back to his father. Finally, James held out the olive-drab ball cap. He used his thumb to carefully brush a smudge of dirt off the Silver Star ribbon before placing it gently on the table in front of Richard. "Your hat, Sergeant?" James said, his voice thick with respect. "Thank you, Commander," Richard replied, placing the hat firmly back on his head. He looked down at the whimpering form of Deacon, who was just beginning to regain consciousness, clutching his shattered knee and moaning in agony. So, what happens to them now? Outside the shattered remains of the rusty skillet, the wail of police sirens began to echo across the arid Mojave landscape. The sound started as a faint whine, rapidly building into an overwhelming chorus as 6 Barstow County Sheriff's Department cruisers tore into the parking lot. Their tires screamed against the asphalt, kicking up thick clouds of dust that mingled with the frantic neon strobe of red and blue emergency lights. The deputies piled out of their vehicles with shotguns and service pistols drawn, their faces tense and pale. They were responding to an officer needs assistance panic call regarding an active, heavily armed gang war. Instead of a chaotic shootout, they found a graveyard of crushed metal. The smoldering, pulverized remains of 6 custom Harley Davidsons lay permanently wedged beneath the heavy grille of a black Chevrolet Suburban. 2 Tier 1 operators, Petty Officer First Class Carter and Senior Chief Jackson, leaned casually against the armored chassis of their vehicles, calmly hydrating with bottled water and securing the perimeter. Sheriff Harrison Boyd, a 30-year veteran of desert law enforcement, pushed his way to the front of the tactical line. Boyd had spent the last decade hunting this specific Hells Angels chapter, dealing with the devastating trail of narcotics they funneled through his jurisdiction. He kept his hand firmly on his holstered Colt .45 as he stepped carefully through the splintered, ruined doorframe of the diner. Boyd stopped dead in his tracks. The scene inside defied logic. 19 ruthless, heavily tattooed criminals, men who had built an empire on fear and intimidation, were secured on the linoleum floor. They were battered, bleeding, securely bound with heavy-duty flex cuffs, and completely stripped of their weapons. Deacon, the monstrous chapter president who had evaded prosecution for years, was weeping openly in the center of the room, clutching a severely compromised knee joint. Boyd looked up and locked eyes with Commander James Caldwell, who was calmly standing near the corner booth. The sheriff released a long, heavy breath and signaled for his deputies to lower their weapons. "Well, I'll be damned," Sheriff Boyd muttered, pulling off his Stetson and running a hand over his graying hair. "Commander Caldwell, dispatch got a frantic call from the Highway Patrol about 3 unmarked SUVs breaking every traffic law on Route 66. I should have known it was SEAL Team 3 breaking the sound barrier." "Morning, Harrison," James replied smoothly, his tone devoid of any residual adrenaline. "Apologies for the mess. We were in the sector running a rapid deployment training exercise. Heard there was a local disturbance involving an elderly civilian." Boyd looked down at Deacon. A satisfied smirk tugged at the corner of the sheriff's mouth. "Disturbance is putting it lightly, Jimmy. This piece of trash has been terrorizing my highways for a decade, but I've got a jurisdictional nightmare on my hands here. How exactly do I write this up? Because my deputies are going to have a hell of a time explaining to a judge how 5 active-duty military personnel assaulted 19 civilians." James's expression hardened into a mask of pure, lethal professionalism. He reached into a utility pouch, strapped to his tactical vest, and pulled out 3 heavy, translucent evidence bags. He tossed them onto the diner counter. They landed with a heavy, definitive thud. Boyd's eyes widened to the size of saucers. The bags were packed tightly, with massive, crystalline shards of pure methamphetamine. "You don't write it up as an assault, Harrison," James stated coldly. "You write it up as a high-level federal narcotics interdiction." The plot twist hit the room with the force of a physical blow. The bikers on the floor, previously groaning from their physical injuries, suddenly went completely silent. The sheer terror of their new reality washed over them. While Chief Miller was disarming them, James explained, gesturing to a massive pile of confiscated brass knuckles, illegal switchblades, and defaced firearms. He noticed the saddlebags on their bikes, and the false linings of their leather cuts were unusually heavy. "We pulled 6 kilos of crystal meth off Deacon alone, plus a half-dozen unregistered suppressed handguns." Deacon, pale and sweating profusely, looked up at James in absolute horror. You can't do that. That's an illegal search." "You don't have jurisdiction, you military freak." James knelt down, bringing his face inches from the ruined gang leader. "I'm a Tier 1 operator, attached to a classified joint task force. But more importantly, 15 minutes ago, While I was driving here at 100 miles an hour, I patched a secure call through to Special Agent Davis at the ATF and Director Sterling at the DEA in Los Angeles. They've been tracking your little desert run since you crossed the border. They officially authorized a joint agency detainment. James's voice dropped to a terrifying whisper meant only for Deacon. You didn't just assault a Vietnam veteran today. You trafficked massive quantities of federal narcotics across state lines while carrying illegal weapons. You aren't going to a local county jail where you can bribe the guards. You are going to a federal supermax penitentiary for the rest of your miserable life. Deacon's head fell back against the floor in total, crushing defeat. His empire was gone. Sheriff Boyd chuckled, a deep, booming sound, and keyed the radio on his shoulder. Dispatch, this is Boyd. I need multiple prisoner transport vans at the Rusty Skillet, and patch me through to the DEA field office. We've got a massive seizure to process. As the deputies moved in to drag the defeated bikers out to the cruisers, Clara, the waitress, emerged from the back, a massive, triumphant smile on her face. Toby the cook gave James a sharp salute and threw fresh bacon onto the grill. James walked back to the corner booth. Richard was sitting calmly, sipping a fresh cup of black coffee, his silver star hat resting proudly on his head. Federal narcotics interdiction, huh? Richard asked, his eyes gleaming with pride. You planned that fast. We adapt and overcome, Dad. James smiled, sliding into the booth. I couldn't let them walk away with just a few broken bones. Bullies like that need to be permanently removed from the board. Richard reached across the table, his scarred hand gripping his son's massive forearm. The years of pain and sacrifice faded away in the presence of true justice. You did good today, Jimmy. Thank you. Anytime, Dad, James replied. Nobody messes with my family. Did this incredible story of ultimate justice make your blood pump? There is absolutely nothing more satisfying than watching arrogant, cruel bullies get an undeniable reality check from the elite warriors trained to protect our nation. The Hells Angels thought they owned the world that morning, assuming they could humiliate a disabled Vietnam veteran for a cheap laugh. Instead, they learned a brutal, life-altering lesson in respect, honor, and the unstoppable force of a Navy SEAL defending his family. These thugs lost their bikes, their freedom, and their pride in less than 20 minutes. If you loved seeing Commander James Caldwell and his Tier 1 team secure justice for an American hero, hit that like button right now. Share this incredible real-life story with your friends to show your support for our veterans. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss another epic video. Drop a comment below and let us know your favorite part of the SEALs takedown.